Welcome to episode 26 of CipherVibe's end-to-end cloud security architecture course. Shared responsibility explains how providers and customers divide security duties. The boundary changes by service model, so teams must turn this principle into a concrete matrix for critical workloads. We will connect its purpose, design boundaries, implementation path, failure modes, and evidence of effectiveness. Every cloud security layer relies on the ones around it. It is the governance layer that clarifies who operates the controls covered in this course: identity, network configuration, workload hardening, data protection, logging, detection, response, compliance, and supplier assurance. Treat the architecture as a chain. A trusted identity requests an action, a policy makes a decision, a workload or data service enforces it, and telemetry records enough context to investigate later. The first building block is understand service model differences. Providers typically secure foundational cloud infrastructure, while customers remain responsible for identities, data, configuration, workloads, and use of services. The balance changes across IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, and specialized managed services, so never assume a control is handled without checking the service documentation and contract. The second building block is create responsibility matrices. For critical services, document who configures, operates, monitors, tests, responds to, and evidences each security control. Include customer teams, provider responsibilities, managed service partners, and incident escalation paths. A useful matrix names the action, not just the party. The third building block is manage configuration as customer responsibility. Treat identity assignments, public exposure, encryption options, logging, data lifecycle, workload configuration, and application code as customer-controlled unless documentation says otherwise. Use templates, guardrails, reviews, and monitoring to make safe choices repeatable across accounts and projects. The fourth building block is prepare for the joint incident. Plan how the organization will open provider support cases, preserve evidence, use emergency contacts, request service-side data, and meet contractual or regulatory notification obligations. Test the process in tabletop exercises, including which decisions the customer must make before a provider can act. Use this reference pattern. Begin with an explicit policy that describes the permitted outcome. Enforce that policy at the closest reliable control point. Route decision and activity evidence to protected storage. Then give an accountable team a tested path to review exceptions, correct drift, and respond to violations. The shared responsibility pattern inventory services maps each control activity to a named owner, automates customer-controlled safeguards, and rehearses the provider-customer incident interface before a real event. Implement this layer in a sequence that preserves evidence and limits blast radius. First, inventory critical cloud services and service models. Second, build a responsibility matrix for each high-risk workload. Third, confirm provider documentation, support plans, and contractual requirements. Fourth, automate customer-owned configuration and evidence collection. Fifth, exercise a joint incident and update ownership gaps. Prefer pilots with a named owner and rollback plan over an unmeasured organization-wide switch. The best rollout is one where a normal workflow succeeds, an unsafe path fails closed, and the team can explain the decision from logs rather than intuition. Security architecture fails most often through assumptions, not dramatic movie-style attacks. First, assuming the provider secures customer IAM, data, or configuration. Second, using one generic matrix for every managed service. Third, leaving provider support escalation untested until an outage. Fourth, failing to assign ownership for evidence, exceptions, and recovery. A configuration screen is not assurance. Collect evidence that the intended control applies to the correct scope and that violations become visible. First, review a sample workload matrix with technical and business owners. Second, test a provider support escalation using a safe scenario. Third, measure matrix coverage for critical services and configuration control ownership. Fourth, confirm incident runbooks, identify evidence, decision rights, and customer communications. Test both normal activity and a safe negative case in an authorized environment. Record the expected decision, the evidence location, the owner who reviews exceptions, and the rollback method. Repeat after platform changes, new integrations, or major shifts in business use. For a practical exercise, create a shared responsibility matrix for a fictional managed database that stores regulated customer information. Use synthetic information or an environment you own or are explicitly authorized to administer. Deliver a one-page diagram, a concise control statement, a list of expected audit events, and one test for an allowed path plus one test for a denied path. This artifact is more valuable than a screenshot because it explains the reasoning behind the configuration. Before scaling this layer, ask 5 review questions. Which assets, identities, or environments are in scope? Who owns the desired state and exception decisions? Which enforcement point can reliably apply the rule? Which records prove the decision and retain enough context for an investigation? And how can the organization revoke access, contain impact, or roll back safely when a control fails? Good architecture makes these answers explicit and testable. The key lesson is that shared responsibility model becomes dependable only when design, policy, enforcement, evidence, and ownership move together. Document the decisions you make, remove permissions and exposure that do not support a real requirement, and rehearse the paths that matter before an incident forces the lesson. Continue through the next episode to connect this control layer to the rest of the CipherVibe cloud security architecture.